Hello there, welcome to HisGov TV, and my name is Collins Nanaya Abebrese. In today's lesson, or in this video, we are going to look at the constitutional developments in the Gold Coast from the period of 1900 up to 1957, when the Gold Coast gained independence. Okay, specifically, we shall take a look at the 1903 Constitution. The features of the 1903 Constitution, and which was the first constitution introduced or promulgated in the Gold Coast in 1903. And that is what we are going to look at in this video. But before we begin with our discussions, I would like to remind you to subscribe to our channel. We have government here, we have CRS, we have history, all of them here. So you subscribe and share our videos to your friends as well. If you have already subscribed, we thank you very much for your support. So before we even go into our lesson objectives for today, let's remind ourselves about what we learned in our previous lessons or video. Now, we learned about the policy of indirect rule, or the British policy of indirect rule. And we also learned about the advantages and the disadvantages of the indirect rule policy. Then we also looked at the reasons why the educated elite opposed the indirect rule policy. All right, and then also why the traditional rulers accepted or embraced the policy of indirect rule in the colony. And those are the lessons that we learned. And so if you missed out on those lessons, I would like to recommend them for you. You go through the year 12 SHS playlist, you can find it there, and then you download it or you watch it because that is a continuation. Today's lesson is a continuation of that lesson. So now let's dive into our lesson proper. Let's go and look at our lesson objectives for today. Now, our lesson objectives for today is quite simple. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to discuss the features of the 1903 Constitution, some of the features of the 1903 Constitution. And then the next one, you should be able to state the limitations of the 1903 Constitution. The limitations or the weakness of the 1903 Constitution. Now, before we start with the introduction, today in Ghana, you are aware that we are using the 1992 Constitution. And now it is a 1992 Constitution because it was drafted in 1992. After the Fourth Republic, and that is why, after the Third Republic, and that is why we call it the 1992 Constitution. But before the 1992 Constitution that we are using today, there were other constitutions that were promulgated or drafted, and this 1903 Constitution was the first of its kind to be drafted in the Gold Coast. And so that is what we are going to look at. Now let's look at our introduction. But before we begin with even the Constitution proper, I would like to show you the nature of administration, how the colony was administered. Because if you don't understand how the colonies were administered during the colonial period by the British, it will be very, very difficult for you to actually understand the details of the various constitutions that were promulgated from 1903. And so let me explain it here. This is the map of colonial Ghana. So this is during the colonial period. This is how the Ghana map looked like in terms of the demarcations. All right, now we had here, this place was known as the Northern Territories. It was taken somewhere in 1902. This place was also known as the Ashanti. All this area was known as the Ashanti. Then we had the Gold Coast colony also here. Then we have the British mandated Togoland also over here. The British mandated Togoland also here. Now, the British saw all the group of people living in these areas as different people. They never considered us as one people. All right. Now, these areas that we have talked about, 1, 2, so we have 1 here, we have 2 here, okay, we have 3, and then 4. These 4 are territories that we have talked about. Each of them was ruled differently or was administered differently. Now, mainly because Ashanti was administered differently from the Gold Coast. Now, when we talk of Gold Coast, this is the Gold Coast, this area, we call it Southern Ghana. That is where we call the Gold Coast. So even in essence, if somebody says that Ghana was, formerly called the Gold Coast, it wasn't the whole Ghana. It wasn't the whole today Ghana. It was just the southern state. This area was what we refer to as the Gold Coast. Ashanti had been Ashanti from day one, and their name had never changed. The British mandated Togoland later became the Volta region, and then the Northern, of course, territory. Now, I was saying that these areas were administered differently. Why? Because Ashanti was considered as a conquered state. All right, the British had conquered the Ashanti territory, this area, so they were administered differently. And the Gold Coast, which was the colony proper, it was the Gold Coast here that the British saw as a colony proper. That is between 1874 up to 1900. It was this area that the British considered as being the colony proper. They were also administered differently. This area, the British mandated Togoland, was formerly part of Togo, but after the First World War, and so Togo at that time, at that period, also was a colony of Germany, and so Germany ruled Togo before the First World War, around 1913 to 1914. So after the First World War and Germany was defeated, Togo was partitioned or shared between France and Britain. These two countries, France and Britain, came together to fight against Germany, and so they were known as the Allied powers. So they decided to share Togo into two, and so the French took the modern day Togo, and then the British took today present day Volta region and some part of the northern region. But during this period, 1956, it was called the British mandated Togoland. So they were not part of the whole Gold Coast. Later on, you know how they became part of the Gold Coast, but that is how the map looked like. And so if you have this at the back of your mind, it will guide you, it will of course help you to understand the issues that will be raised in the Constitution. Now, because these areas or these territories were ruled differently. Now, for instance, Asante and the Northern Territories and the British Togoland were ruled directly by the governor, and the governor was assisted by the chief commissioner and the district commissioners. So the Northern Territory here, Ashanti here, and the British mandated Togoland were administered differently. They were administered directly by the governor, and the governor had district commissioners and chief commissioners in these areas, who were taking instructions from the governor. All right, so here we can say during this period from 1900 to 1902, or during the colonial period, these three areas were ruled, or it was a one-man show. They were ruled by the governor. So what the governor decides is what the district commissioners and the chief commissioners abide by. However, in the Gold Coast proper, at this time, the Gold Coast at this period was a colony proper. This area Ashanti and the Northern Territory and stuff were not that into, they were all considered as protectorate, yeah. But the Gold Coast had, or the colony proper, right, had both executive and legislative council to help the governor in administering this part of the country. So you see that when if you see that when there is an executive and the legislature or the legislative council, then it should tell you that proper governance was actually taking place in the Gold Coast, that's the southern state. Executive council was there, the legislative council was also there, and I believe you know the role of the executive and the legislative council. And so you can compare in your mind. Ashanti, the Northern Territories, the British Mandated Togoland were all ruled by the governor directly through the district commissioners. However, here they had executive, they had the legislative council who will make laws for the colony and all of that. So really, these two areas would be different. Now, between 1900 and 1957, during the colonial period, several constitutions were drafted. Now, the first of its kind was the 1903 Constitution, which we shall look at today. Then, in the 1916 Constitution was in 1916, the Constitution was also promulgated. It was promulgated by a governor called Hugh Clifford, and so the Constitution sometimes is referred to as the Clifford Constitution. Then, in 1925, Sir Frederick Gardner Gatchisberg also introduced a new constitution, which became 1925 Constitution, also known as the Gatchisberg Constitution. And then in 1946, there was another constitution also introduced by Governor Sir Alan Banks, and he was a governor, and because he introduced the constitution, it was named after him. It was known as the Alan Banks Constitution. Then the last one, we shall look at the 1951 Constitution, also known as the Kosi Constitution. And the Kosi Constitution was basically also a constitution set up by this man, Henry Kosi, and so it was also named after him. I think he was the chair in the drafting of that constitution. Yes. So then the last one, we talk about the Nkrumah Constitution. That's 1954. After the first election had been conducted in 1951, Nkrumah also came with his own constitution. So these constitutions are what we are going to look at, even though Nkrumah's constitution, yes, they all fall between 1900 and 1957. That is the colonial period. All right, so we shall look at all these constitutions. Good. Now let's go and look at the features of the 1903 Constitution. Now, bear in mind that this constitution was only applied to the Gold Coast. Ashanti, the Northern Territories, and the British Togoland were not part of this constitution. Now, let's take a look at the executive for council, because we've already established that there was an executive and a legislative council in the colony. Now, the executive council, let's take a look at the composition. So this is the first feature. The executive council are composed or comprised of 4 members initially. These were the colonial secretary, who was in the UK, the financial secretary or the treasurer, the attorney general, and the head of the army. These were the heads of the most important departments of the colony. So the executive council comprised of 4 members. I mean, today, if I asked you of the executive members of the executive in the 1992 Constitution, you talk about the cabinet, you talk about the presidency, the vice president, and all of that. Okay, so the executive council are comprised of these people. 4. One, first of all, is the colonial secretary, who was not in the colony but in UK. The financial secretary or the treasurer, the Attorney General, and the head of the army. Now, this is what then happened. In 1903, for Constitution, it replaced the head of the army with the Director of Public Works. It was believed that it was improper to involve the army in civilian administration. So later in 1903 Constitution, the head of the army was replaced with the Director of Public Works. All right. So the position of the head of the army was given to the Director of Public Works. Good. Then the Executive Council was presided over by the colonial governor. So whenever these these members meet, they were presided over by the governor, the colonial governor. Now all the council members were European civil servants. All the council members were what? Were European civil servants. Now this is supposed to be the feature of the 1903 Constitution with regards to the executives. Now let's do some analysis here. This Executive Council is supposed to be a council for the Gold Coast. However, look at all the council members we talked about. The Colonial Secretary, the Financial Secretary, the Attorney General, the head of the army, even the Director of Public Works, they were all European civil servants. So no, Gold Coaster or African was appointed in the Executive Council, and it was also presided over by the colonial governor. And this is worrying, right? Because when you look at the arms of government, or if you look at governance in itself, the executive is the highest body, in the country, and every decision is taken there. So for you not to have any Gold Coaster, it was worrying. You understand? But let's move on and look at the functions of the Executive Council. The first one was that the council met regularly to consider all major government policies and plans. So let's move on. The council also supervised the proper implementation of government policies. Okay, and then the council served as advisory body to the governor. Okay, so these were some of the functions that were expected of the members of the Executive Council. Advise the governor, to also supervise the proper implementation of government policies and plans, and also consider all government policies and plans. So they meet to talk about what the government wants to do and all of that. And imagine this council has no Gold Coaster, so they meet to discuss about the Gold Coast, and there is no Gold Coaster in there, and that is not fair. I don't think you would agree to that. So let's take a look at the limitations. So what do you think are the limitations of the Executive Council in the 1903 Constitution? Now, when we talk about the limitations, we are just talking about the weakness, what you find wrong, undemocratic, about the council, or the composition or the nature of the council. And that is what we termed as the weakness of any of the council. So in your own mind, what do you consider as being awkward, undemocratic, about the members of the Executive Council? I've already talked about some of them. So let's see if maybe what I talked about or what you are thinking is there. The first one is that the council served as an advisory body to the governor, which means that the council cannot impose on the governor. The governor had the right to either accept or not to accept what the advice of the council, which means that the governor had veto power. When we talk of veto power, he could do anything that he liked. If he alone decides he doesn't want this to be done, it will not be done. And that is what we term as veto power. Now, the governor was not obliged to accept the advice of the council, as I have talked about already. And this is a limitation, a weakness. In the event of disagreement or disapproval of the council's advice on an issue, the governor was expected to state his reason and notify the Secretary of State in London. So if the governor was not in support of any issue, all that he just had to do was to report to the Secretary of State for the colonies in the UK. So you see that the governor was not responsible to the people, but rather was responsible to the people who lived in the US or the British or the Crown. Okay, and that is also a weakness. The Executive Council was made up of only European civil servants. This provoked a storm of protests by the people because they, European civil servants, could not be relied upon to promote the interest of Ghanaians or the Gold Coasters. So, as I already indicated, all the members were European civil servants, and governance is about promoting interest of your citizens. And so how can you be taking decisions and policies for people who are not part of the decision making process? So that was also a limitation, and so the educated elite especially were not in support of this constitution. They felt it was bad. Now let's go and look at the membership of the Legislative Council. And by the way, I know you know what a Legislative Council does, making laws, Parliament in general, as you have seen some pictures down there. So let's look at the composition. The Legislative Council was chaired by the governor. So the governor chaired both the Executive and the Legislative Council. The council was made up of both official and unofficial members, all right? The official members were a group of senior government officials appointed by the colonial governor, and they were in majority. So in our subsequent lessons, we will be looking at the fact that, or we will come across the fact that in the Legislative Council, there were both official and unofficial membership, and the officials were the ones who were appointed by the governors directly, and they were in the majority. The unofficial members were also held on official positions in the colonial administration. The difference between the official and the unofficial members was that the official members normally they are the heads of the institutions, the army, various state institutions. They are normally banking and all of that, mining. They are, of course, normally the official members. The unofficial members were members who also held on to official positions. Some of them were either appointed by the governor or elected by the people. And so that is what you should know when you come across both official and then unofficial membership. So this is a picture. Let me show you. This is a picture of how the National Assembly or the Legislative Council looked like, and this is the modern one you find here. Now let's look at the functions of the Legislative Council. You already know the function of a Legislative Council, a lawmaking body. It was expected to make laws for the good governance of the country. Also, it was also expected to consider bills and pass ordinances and laws deemed appropriate for the smooth administration of the colony. All right, so they make laws, they pass bills and all of that. The Legislative Council again debated the proposed annual budget of the government. So they almost do the same thing as our parliament does today. The council also provided forum for discussing the problems and grievances of the people. Okay, so now let's go and look at the weakness of this Legislative Council. Already, I have told you that the governor was the chair of the council, and the governor could decide to veto everything that the council had agreed on. The decision of the colonial council could not always prevail, in the sense that it was subject to the governor's veto power. Imagine that government decides to, Parliament decides or pass a law, and the president says, I will not accept this law. I have vetoed all that you have, talked about. And don't forget, in governance, the council, the legislative council, represents the people. So anything done at the council is deemed to be in support. The people have done it. The people have, passed that kind of bill. But here we are at the mercies of the governor, and that is undemocratic. So that was a weakness. Okay, that is undemocratic. The next one was that the nature of composition of the council was uneven. It was dominated by whites, whilst Ghanaians formed the minority on the council. So this council is supposed to make laws for the Gold Coast. However, we find only few Ghanaians in there. The whites are rather in the majority. So their interest is always going to be ahead of the interest of Ghanaians. There was a limited application of the elective principle, which excluded Ashanti, the Northern Territories, and British Transvaal Togoland from the council. This did not promote effective integration of the country. So as we have already established, Ashanti, the Northern Territories, and the British Mandatory Togoland were ruled differently. So this constitution did not apply to them. Now, more so, elective principle, when we talk of elective principle, giving an individual the right to vote, that also was not applied in the 1903 constitution. A lot of the members that were in the council were actually appointed. So this we also say it's undemocratic. As educated elite, we will say this is an undemocratic constitution. And so the educated elite would always protest against this. They protested against this 1903 constitution, which would then lead to the promulgation or the introduction of a new constitution in 1916 by Hugh Clifford. Good, so I think that is the end of our discussion. It's been a very long one for that matter. Try your hands on this work. Outline any three features of the 1903 constitution of the Gold Coast. It could be in the executive or the legislative composition of government. Have a nice day, and thank you very much for watching.